The morning sky was bright blue as the sun bounced off the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Everything looked clean and new, like someone had spread a giant white blanket over the neighborhood. It was the first real snowfall of the winter, and everyone was excited, especially the kids. Anthony and his 8-year-old daughter Lily stood at their front window, watching as their neighbors shoveled driveways and children ran around making snow angels. "Can we go build a snowman, Dad?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with hope. She was bouncing on her toes, already dressed in her purple snow pants and matching jacket. Anthony smiled at his daughter. They had only moved to this neighborhood 3 weeks ago, and he was happy to see her excited about something. The move had been hard on her after his wife's job transfer, and she missed her old friends terribly. "Of course we can, sweetie. Let's get our stuff together." He grabbed their winter gear, thick gloves, warm hats, and sturdy boots. Anthony also packed a small bag with snowman-making supplies, a carrot from the fridge, some buttons from Lily's craft box, and an old scarf his mother had knitted years ago. 20 minutes later, they were trudging through the snow toward the community park. The park sat in the middle of their new neighborhood, with an open field perfect for snowman building. A few other families were scattered around, some sledding down the small hill on the far side, others having snowball fights near the playground. "Over there, Dad." Lily pointed to an empty spot under a big oak tree. "That's where our snowman should live." They started with the base, rolling a small snowball around and around until it grew bigger and bigger. Anthony showed Lily how to pack the snow tight so it wouldn't fall apart. Their hands got cold, but neither complained. This was the most fun they'd had since moving in. "You're really good at this, Lily," Anthony said as they finished the middle section. His daughter beamed with pride. "I learned from watching videos with Mom," she explained, carefully placing the middle snowball on top of the base. "Now we need the head, and it has to be perfect." As they worked on the final piece, Anthony noticed how the sun made the snow sparkle all around them. He took a moment to look at his daughter, her cheeks red from the cold, her smile wide and genuine for the first time in weeks. These were the moments that mattered most to him. "Dad, look, our snowman is almost done." Lily clapped her mittened hands together. The snowman was slightly lopsided but charming, with 3 different-sized snowballs stacked on top of each other. Anthony pulled out their supplies. Now for the finishing touches. He handed Lily the carrot, and she carefully pushed it into the middle of the face for a nose. "He needs eyes, Dad," she said seriously, taking 2 buttons from her father's outstretched hand. She stood on her tiptoes to place them just right, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Other park visitors smiled as they walked by, some stopping to compliment their creation. An older man with his grandson gave them a thumbs up. A woman walking her dog waved cheerfully. Anthony felt good about their new neighborhood. Maybe this place could become home after all. "What should we name him?" Anthony asked as they wrapped the scarf around the snowman's neck. Lily thought for a moment, her head tilted to one side. "Mr. Chili," she finally declared, making Anthony laugh. "Mr. Chili it is," he agreed. They stepped back to admire their work, not noticing the woman watching them from across the street. She stood at her window, phone in hand, her face pinched with suspicion as she observed the father and daughter enjoying their day in the snow. Anthony put his arm around Lily's shoulders, feeling truly happy. "What do you think? Is he the best snowman ever?" "The very best," Lily nodded, leaning against her father's side. Neither of them had any idea that their perfect snow day was about to take an unexpected turn. Anthony and Lily were putting the finishing touches on Mr. Chili when Anthony felt that uncomfortable feeling of being watched. He glanced around and spotted a woman marching across the street toward the park. She wore a heavy beige coat with a fur-trimmed hood and expensive-looking boots that sank into the snow with each determined step. "Excuse me," the woman called out, her voice sharp enough to make Lily stop adjusting Mr. Chili's scarf. "Excuse me, I need to speak with you." Anthony straightened up, instinctively moving slightly in front of his daughter. He recognized the tone. He'd heard it before when shopping in upscale stores or when barbecuing in the common area at their old apartment complex. "Can I help you?" he asked politely, keeping his voice calm for Lily's sake. The woman stopped about 10 feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pinched with what looked like a mixture of annoyance and suspicion. I've been watching you from my house, she said, nodding toward a large gray home across from the park. Do you actually live around here? This park is for residents only. Lily looked up at her father, confusion written across her small face. Anthony placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Yes, we moved into the Cedar Lane houses a few weeks ago, he explained. We're just enjoying the snow day. The woman, who appeared to be in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair visible under her hood, looked them up and down as if searching for proof they didn't belong. I know everyone in this neighborhood, she stated flatly. I'm Mrs. Winters. I'm on the community board, and I've never seen you before. Well, like I said, we're new, Anthony replied, still keeping his tone even. I'm Anthony, and this is my daughter Lily. We live in the blue house on Maple Street. Lily waved shyly, but Mrs. Winters didn't acknowledge her. Instead, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. That snow belongs to the park. You can't just come here and take it. Anthony almost laughed, thinking she must be joking. But her stern expression made it clear she was completely serious. Ma'am, we're just building a snowman. Everyone builds snowmen in parks. You're being too loud, Mrs. Winters continued as if he hadn't spoken. I could hear you from inside my house. Anthony looked around at the other families in the park, children yelling with glee as they threw snowballs, parents calling out to be careful on the sledding hill. No one was paying any attention to him and Lily quietly building their snowman. I think we're being pretty reasonable, Anthony said. Lily was just excited about the snow. Mrs. Winters pulled out her phone from her coat pocket. Well, I don't feel comfortable with you here. You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood. Lily tugged at her father's jacket. Dad, what does she mean? She whispered, her voice small and confused. Nothing, sweetie, Anthony reassured her, though his heart was sinking. He had hoped this new neighborhood would be different. Mrs. Winters was now openly holding her phone up, her thumb hovering over the screen. I'm going to call the police if you don't leave right now. A couple walking nearby slowed down, overhearing the confrontation. They exchanged concerned glances but didn't intervene. There's no need for that, Anthony said, his voice still steady despite the anger and hurt building inside him. We're not doing anything wrong. Dad. Lily's voice wavered. Did we do something bad? No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong at all. Mrs. Winters started dialing, turning slightly away as she spoke into her phone. Yes, I need to report a disturbance at Oakwood Park. There's a man here who doesn't belong in the neighborhood, and he's letting his child destroy park property. Anthony felt a flash of heat rise to his face despite the cold air. He had two choices: leave and let Lily think they had done something wrong, or stay and deal with whatever happened next. He took a deep breath and reached for his own phone. Lily, stay right next to me, okay? He said softly. Mrs. Winters continued her call, her voice growing louder. Yes, I feel threatened. They won't leave when asked. Please send someone right away. Anthony pressed the video record button on his phone just as Mrs. Winters turned back toward them, her face twisted with an expression that made Lily press closer to her father's side. Anthony's hand was steady as he held his phone, recording Mrs. Winters while she continued her call with the police. The red record button blinked steadily in the corner of his screen. He had learned years ago that having proof was sometimes the only way to be believed. Yes, officer, Mrs. Winters was saying, her voice raised so Anthony could clearly hear every word. There's a man and a child in the park who don't belong here. They're disturbing the peace and damaging public property. Damaging public property. Anthony repeated quietly, making sure his phone captured his response. We're building a snowman. Mrs. Winters shot him an angry look. Are you recording me? That's an invasion of my privacy. Stop that immediately. We're in a public park, Anthony replied calmly, and I have every right to document what's happening here. Lily was pressed against her father's side, her small hand clutching his jacket. Dad, why is she so mad at us? She whispered. Anthony wished he could shield her from this moment, but maybe it was better that she understood the world they lived in, even at 8 years old. Some people jump to wrong conclusions, honey. Mrs. Winters was now pacing back and forth, her boots leaving angry tracks in the pristine snow. The police are on their way, she announced triumphantly. They'll sort this out. A few other families had noticed the commotion. A father with two young boys walked closer, concern on his face. "Everything okay over here?" he asked, looking between Anthony and Mrs. Winters. Before Anthony could respond, Mrs. Winters jumped in. "This man is harassing me and won't leave when asked. I've called the police." The father looked confused. "I've been watching from over there. They're just making a snowman." "You don't understand," Mrs. Winters said, lowering her voice. "He doesn't live around here. I know all the homeowners in this neighborhood." Anthony kept his camera rolling. "Actually, we moved into the blue house on Maple Street 3 weeks ago. My daughter and I are just enjoying the public park, which we have every right to do." The father nodded. "That's the old Wilson place, right? Nice house." "You know them?" Mrs. Winters demanded. "No, but they're building a snowman, not committing a crime," the man said with a shrug. He turned to Anthony. "Sorry about this. Welcome to the neighborhood." As the father walked back to his children, Anthony felt a small wave of relief at the simple act of kindness. He turned the camera to capture Mr. Chili, their now-forgotten snowman project. "Look, this is the property damage we're being accused of," he narrated quietly. Lily, seeing the camera pointed at their creation, managed a small smile. "His name is Mr. Chili," she added, her voice barely audible. In the distance, a police car pulled up to the park entrance, its lights flashing but siren off. Anthony felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his expression neutral for Lily's sake. "It's going to be okay," he told her softly. "We haven't done anything wrong." Mrs. Winters straightened her coat and marched toward the approaching officer. "Over here. I'm the one who called." Anthony turned his phone to capture the police car and the officer stepping out. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair visible under his hat. His face was serious but not aggressive as he surveyed the scene. A half-built snowman, a small girl huddled against her father, and an agitated woman hurrying toward him. "Stay right here with me, Lily," Anthony instructed gently. "Everything's going to be fine." "Should we leave, Dad?" Lily asked, her eyes wide as she watched the officer. Anthony shook his head. "No, sweetie. We haven't done anything wrong, and we don't need to run away. Sometimes in life, you have to stand your ground when you know you're right." Mrs. Winters was now gesturing wildly as she spoke to the officer, pointing repeatedly at Anthony and Lily. The officer nodded, listening carefully, but his eyes kept moving between her and the father-daughter duo with their snowman. Anthony took a deep breath and prepared for what came next. His main concern wasn't himself, it was making sure Lily didn't walk away from this thinking they had done something to be ashamed of. He wanted her to remember standing tall with dignity, not running away in fear. The officer finally started walking in their direction, with Mrs. Winters following closely behind, a look of satisfaction on her face. Anthony's finger hovered over the stop button on his recording, but he decided to keep it going. "Hello, sir," the officer called as he approached. "I'm Officer Thomas with the community police. Mind if I have a word with you?" Anthony nodded respectfully. "Of course, officer." "I'm Anthony, and this is my daughter Lily. We're just out enjoying the snow day." Officer Thomas glanced at the snowman, then back at Anthony's phone, which was clearly recording. A slight smile crossed his face. "I see," he said, "and I also see you're documenting our conversation." "Yes, sir," Anthony replied, "just for everyone's protection and clarity." Mrs. Winters stood watching for another minute, her face a mixture of emotions. Finally, without another word, she turned and trudged back across the street to her house. A few of the onlookers approached Anthony, introducing themselves as neighbors. An older woman with a bright red hat touched his arm gently. "I'm sorry that happened," she said quietly. "Most of us aren't like that. Welcome to the neighborhood." Anthony nodded gratefully, still recording as Officer Thomas and Lily worked on completing Mr. Chili's head. The officer was showing her how to shape it perfectly round, their laughter floating across the snowy park. "Dad, come help," Lily called, her earlier fear completely forgotten. Anthony pocketed his phone and joined them, keenly aware that this moment had transformed from something ugly into something unexpectedly beautiful. The story could have gone very differently, and he knew many similar stories did. Mr. Chili's going to need those buttons and that carrot now, he said, reaching into his pocket for the supplies they brought. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as Anthony, Lily, and Officer Thomas put the finishing touches on Mr. Chili. The snowman now stood proudly complete, with a carrot nose, button eyes, and a colorful scarf wrapped around his neck. Several other families had joined them, turning the uncomfortable incident into something of an impromptu neighborhood gathering. "What do you think, Lily? Is Mr. Chili perfect now?" Officer Thomas asked, stepping back to admire their work. Lily circled the snowman, inspecting it with serious consideration. "He needs arms," she decided. A boy about Lily's age who had been watching nearby ran off and returned moments later with 2 perfect Y-shaped sticks. "Will these work?" he asked shyly. Lily grinned and accepted them. "They're perfect. Dad, can you help me put them in?" Anthony helped his daughter position the stick arms on either side of the snowman. When they finished, several people clapped, and someone took a group photo of everyone who had helped with Mr. Chili. Officer Thomas checked his watch. "Well, I should probably get back to my regular patrol," he said, "but I'm glad I got to help with such a fine snowman." "Thank you," Anthony said quietly, extending his hand. "I appreciate how you handled this situation." The officer shook his hand firmly. "Just doing my job the way it should be done." He lowered his voice. "That video you took might be worth sharing, by the way. People need to see these things." As Officer Thomas headed back to his patrol car, he tipped his hat to Lily. "Keep building snowmen, young lady. You've got talent." Lily beamed with pride. A woman with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes approached Anthony. "I'm Grace. I'm the Neighborhood Association president. Mrs. Winters isn't on any community board like she claimed." She handed Anthony a card. "This is my number. We have a neighborhood welcome dinner next Friday at the community center. We'd love for you and Lily to come." "Thanks," Anthony said, genuinely surprised. "We'd like that." As Grace walked away, Anthony noticed his phone buzzing with notifications. He had been live-streaming the entire incident to his social media account without even realizing it. The video had already been shared hundreds of times. "Dad, can we get hot chocolate?" Lily asked, tugging at his sleeve. "My fingers are cold." "Good idea," Anthony replied, pocketing his phone. "Let's head home." As they gathered their things, the boy who had brought the stick arms approached again with his parents. "We live on Maple Street too," the boy's father said. "I'm Tom, this is my wife Patty, and our son Jack. We're about 4 houses down from you, the house with the red door." "Nice to meet you," Anthony said. "I'm Anthony, and this is Lily." "Jack's been hoping to meet other kids in the neighborhood," Patty explained. "Would Lily like to come over for cookies and hot chocolate?" "You're welcome too, of course." Anthony looked at Lily, who was already chatting excitedly with Jack about their favorite cookies. He smiled. "That sounds great, actually." As they walked together toward Maple Street, Anthony glanced back at the park. Mrs. Winter's house was dark, curtains drawn. He wondered if she was watching them leave together, what she might be thinking. His phone continued to buzz. Looking down, he saw that his video was now at thousands of shares. Comments were pouring in. "This is how police should respond." "That officer deserves a medal." "Anyone know the backstory here?" "This made me cry." "Thank you for sharing." Anthony wasn't sure how he felt about going viral. He hadn't intended to broadcast the incident to the world, but maybe Officer Thomas was right. People needed to see these things, both the bad and the good. Later that evening, after cookies and hot chocolate at their new neighbor's house, Anthony tucked Lily into bed. She was tired but happy, already making plans to play with Jack again tomorrow if the snow lasted. "Dad," she said sleepily, "why was that lady so mad at us today?" Anthony sat on the edge of her bed, considering how to answer. "Some people are afraid of things they don't understand, or people who look different from them," he said finally. "She didn't know us, so she made wrong guesses about who we are." "But Officer Thomas was nice," Lily pointed out. "Yes, he was," Anthony agreed. "And so were Jack's parents and Grace and the other people at the park. That's important to remember. There are more good people than bad ones." Lily yawned. "Mr. Chili was the best snowman ever." "He sure was," Anthony smiled, kissing her forehead. "Get some sleep, sweetie." As he closed her door, his phone rang. It was a local news station, asking if he would be willing to give an interview about the incident at the park. The reporter explained that Officer Thomas was receiving praise for his handling of the situation, and they wanted Anthony's perspective. Anthony looked at his daughter's door, thinking about the lessons of the day. Maybe sharing this story could help change things, even just a little bit. Yes, he told the reporter, I'll do the interview. Anthony sat nervously in the small waiting area of the local news station. He had never been interviewed on TV before. The walls were covered with framed photos of news anchors and reporters, smiling professionally at the camera. A young woman with a clipboard approached him. Mr. Reynolds, they're ready for you now. He followed her through a maze of corridors until they reached the studio. Under the bright lights, a news anchor named Diane Chen smiled warmly and motioned for him to sit in the chair across from her. Just relax, she said as a technician clipped a small microphone to Anthony's shirt collar. We'll just have a conversation about what happened yesterday at the park. Your video has really touched a lot of people. Anthony nodded, surprised at how quickly everything had happened. Just 24 hours ago, he and Lily had been building a simple snowman. Now that snowman had become something of a local symbol. The red light on the camera blinked on, and Diane turned to face it. Good evening. I'm Diane Chen. Last night, a video went viral showing what started as a troubling confrontation in Oak Hill Park, but ended with a moment of community that has people talking. Today, we're joined by Anthony Reynolds, who recorded that video while out building a snowman with his 8-year-old daughter. The camera turned to include Anthony, who sat up a little straighter. Anthony, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us what happened yesterday? Taking a deep breath, Anthony recounted the story, how he and Lily had been enjoying the snow, how Mrs. Winters had approached them and called the police, and how Officer Thomas had diffused the situation. The remarkable thing, Diane said, is that your video doesn't just show the problem, it shows a solution. Officer Thomas turned what could have been a traumatic experience for your daughter into something positive. Anthony nodded. He did, and I'm grateful for that. So many of these stories don't end that way. Your video has been viewed over 2 million times since yesterday, Diane said. Why do you think it's resonating with so many people? Anthony thought for a moment. I think people are hungry for stories where things go right. Officer Thomas could have handled the situation very differently. Instead, he showed what good policing looks like. And the neighbors who came over afterward, they showed what good community looks like. The interview continued for a few more minutes. When it ended, the producer thanked Anthony and handed him a business card. If anything else develops with this story, please let us know. Outside the studio, Anthony checked his phone. There were dozens of missed calls and hundreds of new notifications. His video had now been picked up by national news outlets, and #Machili was trending on social media. As he drove home, Anthony passed Oak Hill Park and noticed something that made him pull over. Where Mr. Chili had stood yesterday, there were now at least a dozen snowmen of all shapes and sizes. Families were out in the snow, building more. Some had signs propped against them with messages like, "Hate has no home here," and "All are welcome." Anthony took a quick picture and texted it to the news producer. When he got home, Lily was at the window watching for him. She ran to the door as he came in. "Dad, I was on TV. Jack's mom recorded it and showed me." "You sure were," Anthony smiled, hanging up his coat. "And guess what? Mrs. Grace from the neighborhood came by with a big basket of stuff for us. She said it's a welcome gift. There's cookies and hot chocolate and a gift card to the pizza place." The doorbell rang. Anthony opened it to find a delivery person holding a large bouquet of flowers. "Delivery for Anthony Reynolds." Anthony accepted the flowers, reading the small card attached. "Thank you for making our community better. Your neighbors on Maple Street." Throughout the evening, the doorbell kept ringing, more deliveries, neighbors stopping by to introduce themselves, even a reporter from another news station hoping for an interview. Anthony's phone continued to explode with notifications and messages. Just before Lily's bedtime, she brought her tablet to Anthony. "Dad, look, Mr. Chili is famous." She showed him an online article titled "The Snowman That Brought a Community Together." There was a picture of their snowman with Officer Thomas, Anthony, and Lily all smiling beside it. "People are making Mr. Chili drawings and stuff," Lily said, scrolling through images people had created and shared online. He's like a superhero or something. Anthony hugged his daughter, amazed at how their simple snow day had turned into something so much bigger. As he tucked Lily into bed that night, she asked, "Is Mrs. Winters still mad at us?" "I don't know, sweetie," Anthony answered honestly. "But I hope she's thinking about things differently now." "Maybe she needs a friend," Lily suggested sleepily. "Everyone's nicer when they have friends." Anthony smiled at his daughter's simple wisdom. "Maybe you're right." After Lily fell asleep, Anthony sat in his living room, watching as the view count on his video continued to climb. He had received messages from people all over the country sharing similar experiences, some with happy endings like his, many without. One message in particular caught his attention. It was from a community organizer in a neighboring town. "Your video is powerful. Would you consider speaking at our upcoming community forum on building better relationships between police and citizens? Your positive experience could help create a blueprint for how these situations should be handled." Anthony stared at the message for a long time before typing his reply. "Yes. I think that's exactly what Mr. Chili would want." 2 weeks had passed since the Snowman incident, and life in the neighborhood had changed in ways Anthony never could have imagined. The snow had melted, leaving behind muddy patches of grass and the memory of Mr. Chili, but the connections formed that day remained strong. Anthony stood at the entrance of the community center, watching people file in for the neighborhood meeting he had helped organize. The room was already filling up with familiar and unfamiliar faces. Jack's parents waved to him from near the refreshment table. Officer Thomas stood chatting with Grace, the neighborhood association president. Local news cameras were set up at the back of the room. "Nervous?" Grace asked, approaching Anthony with a cup of coffee for him. "A little," he admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "I've never done anything like this before." "You're a natural," she assured him. "Look how many people showed up." Anthony scanned the room again, noticing faces from all over the community. His gaze stopped at a figure standing uncertainly in the doorway. It was Mrs. Winters. She looked different somehow, smaller, less imposing than she had that day in the park. She clutched her purse tightly, glancing around as if wondering whether she should come in or leave. Taking a deep breath, Anthony walked over to her. "Mrs. Winters," he said simply. "I'm glad you came." She looked startled, then composed herself. I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome." "Everyone's welcome. That's the whole point of tonight." She nodded stiffly. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened." Before Anthony could respond, Lily came running up with Jack. "Dad, we finished setting up the display." At the front of the room, the two children had arranged drawings from local kids of what an ideal neighborhood should look like. Dozens of colorful pictures showed people of different colors holding hands, playing together, and of course, building snowmen. "It looks great, sweetheart," Anthony said. Lily noticed Mrs. Winters and fell silent, stepping closer to her father. "Hello," Mrs. Winters said awkwardly. "Your drawings are very nice." Lily gave a small nod of acknowledgement before tapping on her father's hand. "It's almost time to start, Dad." "I'll be right there," he told her. As Lily ran back to the front, Anthony turned to Mrs. Winters. "There's plenty of seats. Please stay." She hesitated, then nodded and moved toward a chair in the back row. Anthony walked to the small podium at the front of the room. The buzz of conversation gradually died down as people took their seats. He adjusted the microphone, looking out at the diverse crowd, young families, elderly residents, people of all backgrounds united in this space. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. 2 weeks ago, I was just a guy building a snowman with his daughter. Now I'm standing here talking to all of you about community. Life takes some unexpected turns, doesn't it? Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. You've all seen the video by now. What started as an uncomfortable moment turned into something positive, thanks to Officer Thomas. Anthony gestured toward the officer, and there was a round of applause. But it could have ended very differently. He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've received thousands of messages from people sharing similar stories, many without happy endings. And that's why we're here tonight. Not to point fingers or assign blame, but to talk about how we create the kind of community where Mr. Chili moments become the rule, not the exception." Over the next hour, people shared stories, ideas, and commitments. Officer Thomas talked about community policing. Grace discussed plans for more neighborhood events. A teacher from the local elementary school proposed a buddy system for welcoming new families. Throughout it all, Anthony noticed Mrs. Winters listening intently, occasionally nodding. She didn't speak, but she stayed. As the meeting wrapped up, Anthony made his final announcement. Before we go, I have something special to share. With help from the Parks Department and donations from local businesses, we'll be installing a permanent Mr. Chili sculpture in Oak Hill Park this spring. He unveiled a small model of a metal snowman. It'll serve as a reminder that our community is a place where everyone belongs, where misunderstandings can lead to understanding, and where we look out for each other. The crowd broke into applause. People began to mingle, discussing action items and signing up for committees. Anthony found himself surrounded by well-wishers and volunteers. Later, as the crowd thinned, he noticed Mrs. Winters standing by the model of the Mr. Chili sculpture, examining it closely. He walked over to join her. "It's a nice tribute," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Thank you," Anthony replied. She turned to face him finally. "I've been wanting to say, I'm sorry for what happened that day. I was wrong." The words clearly didn't come easily to her, but they were sincere. "I appreciate that," Anthony said. "My behavior was inexcusable," she continued. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years and I've seen it change. I guess I was afraid of more change, but that's no excuse. Fear makes us do things we wouldn't normally do," Anthony said. "The question is what we do after we recognize that fear." Mrs. Winters nodded thoughtfully. "I signed up for the welcome committee," she said, gesturing to the volunteer sheet. "I thought maybe I could help new families feel at home here instead of what I did with your family." Anthony smiled. "That sounds like a great start." As they talked, Lily approached cautiously, holding one of the children's drawings. "Excuse me," she said politely to Mrs. Winters. "Would you like a cookie? Jack and I are giving them out to everyone." Mrs. Winters looked surprised, then touched. "Yes, I would. Thank you." Lily handed her a chocolate chip cookie wrapped in a napkin, then offered the drawing she was holding. "This is for you. I made it today." The drawing showed a group of stick figures standing around a snowman. The figures were different colors and sizes, but they were all smiling, all holding hands in a circle around Mr. Chili. Mrs. Winters accepted it with trembling hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." As Lily ran off to distribute more cookies, Anthony watched Mrs. Winters carefully fold the drawing and place it in her purse. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "it takes a child to show us the way forward." Outside, the first new buds of spring were appearing on the trees. Inside, a different kind of new beginning was taking root, one snowman at a time. Over the next hour, people shared stories, ideas, and commitments. Officer Thomas talked about community policing. Grace discussed plans for more neighborhood events. A teacher from the local elementary school proposed a buddy system for welcoming new families. Throughout it all, Anthony noticed Mrs. Winters listening intently, occasionally nodding. She didn't speak, but she stayed. As the meeting wrapped up, Anthony made his final announcement. "Before we go, I have something special to share. With help from the Parks Department and donations from local businesses, we'll be installing a permanent Mr. Chili sculpture in Oak Hill Park this spring." He unveiled a small model of a metal snowman. "It'll serve as a reminder that our community is a place where everyone belongs, where misunderstandings can lead to understanding, and where we look out for each other." The crowd broke into applause. People began to mingle, discussing action items and signing up for committees. Anthony found himself surrounded by well-wishers and volunteers. Later, as the crowd thinned, he noticed Mrs. Winters standing by the model of the Mr. Chili sculpture, examining it closely. He walked over to join her. "It's a nice tribute," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Thank you," Anthony replied. She turned to face him finally. "I've been wanting to say, I'm sorry for what happened that day. I was wrong." The words clearly didn't come easily to her, but they were sincere. "I appreciate that," Anthony said. "My behavior was inexcusable," she continued. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years and I've seen it change. I guess I was afraid of more change, but that's no excuse. Fear makes us do things we wouldn't normally do," Anthony said. "The question is what we do after we recognize that fear." Mrs. Winters nodded thoughtfully. I signed up for the welcome committee, she said, gesturing to the volunteer sheet. I thought maybe I could help new families feel at home here instead of what I did with your family. Anthony smiled. That sounds like a great start. As they talked, Lily approached cautiously, holding one of the children's drawings. Excuse me, she said politely to Mrs. Winters. Would you like a cookie? Jack and I are giving them out to everyone. Mrs. Winters looked surprised, then touched. Yes, I would. Thank you. Lily handed her a chocolate chip cookie wrapped in a napkin, then offered the drawing she was holding. This is for you. I made it today. The drawing showed a group of stick figures standing around a snowman. The figures were different colors and sizes, but they were all smiling, all holding hands in a circle around Mr. Chili. Mrs. Winters accepted it with trembling hands. It's beautiful, she whispered. Thank you. As Lily ran off to distribute more cookies, Anthony watched Mrs. Winters carefully fold the drawing and place it in her purse. Sometimes, he said quietly, it takes a child to show us the way forward. Outside, the first new buds of spring were appearing on the trees. Inside, a different kind of new beginning was taking root, one snowman at a time.